And welcome everyone to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled Teaching Language as Archive, Kreol and Colonialism in Mauritius. I'm very pleased to be joined by Elsa VA. She's the K-16 Education Program Outreach Director of the African Studies Center at Boston University. Today is April the 12th, 2022. Hey everyone, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President for Education at the Center, and on behalf of my team, my staff, my colleagues, Jira and Mike and Meredith, I want to welcome you back to the webinar series. I suspect that many of you are either coming off of or going into spring break. This is always a sort of an odd time to schedule events and activities like this because I know that spring brings all kinds of disruptions in your own academic calendar, but we appreciate you joining us. And it's always a pleasure to see teachers from all over the country come together for these 90-minute discussions on the humanities. In particular, I want to welcome Brenda from joining us from Washington, D.C. Brenda's in Howard University, and really pleased to see you with us tonight, Brenda. Jessamine is from Napa Valley in California. Kate is up in Wisconsin. Brian, it's been a long time, North Andover High School in Massachusetts. Tish is in New Haven, Connecticut, and as always, we have numerous Los Angeles teachers. It's such a pleasure to see so many Southern California folks with us. Alejandro, Ida, Jamie at Sun Valley Magnet, and Darlene, just to name a few. Thank you for joining us. The center, located in Durham, North Carolina, is really an intellectual space where scholars from many different humanities backgrounds can come together and be thoughtful about their approach and the new scholarship that emerges in the field of the humanities. I'm really pleased that we have numerous international fellows who have been joining us over the last 4 or 5 years, including at least 2 or 3 a year who come from various countries and institutions in Africa. And it's always super interesting to hear their perspective of the ways that they approach global studies and understanding colonization. And it seems like the currency that's the most valuable to all these folks is language, and it's the way we express ourselves and the ways that language can be weaponized. And I'm hopeful that tonight's conversation with Elsa can help give you some really clear and specific ways to introduce these themes and concepts to your students, regardless of age, down as early as upper elementary school, right up to the college students that you might be working with. The resources that we'll mention are all available in a free and open platform called the Humanities in Class Digital Library. All of you have library cards. I hope you use them often and regularly. I hope as the summer turns around and you start to be thinking about your curriculum development, that you also use this as a place to not only find the rigorous and high quality materials that the center creates, but also materials that are copyright with a Creative Commons license that means you can use them in an open way in your classroom. This is where we house and make available all the readings and the associated resources for webinars, including tonight's. This is also where we'll place the recordings of the webinars. If you usually give us about a week to process them, we get them loaded into the digital library as well. As I mentioned, in addition to the center's content, we also have numerous content provider partners, including the African Studies Center at BU, also including the African Studies Center at Howard. Again, Brenda, thank you so much for your warm and healthy collaboration. Again, this is a place where you can find resources that address tonight's topic and use them as follow-ups of ways that you can build them into your instruction. It's hard to believe, but our webinar series is drawing to a conclusion. We only have 5 left after tonight. I do hope that you consider joining us for any one of the upcoming 5. Please share these with your colleagues and with folks in your department, and encourage them to also take advantage of exploring any one of these wonderful topics. It's likely, though, at the end of the year, you'll miss our webinar series, you'll miss visiting with me on a weekly basis, but you'll still need some professional development credits. And if that's the case, I do encourage you to take a look at our online course catalog, where you can earn between 25 and 35 credit hours. Our summer sessions are scheduled in week-long increments, and we do have numerous courses that are applicable not only for what you teach and the disciplines you consider, but also have been certified by the divisions that you work in. Although it's not on the screen, I just realized my error in not including this. We do have a very popular course called Medieval Africa and Africans that do explore and explode several myths of ancient Africa As you approach this in your curriculum, we found to be very helpful. Had the pleasure of meeting our Teacher Advisory Council this past week when we brought them to Durham for our annual 2-day retreat. Thank goodness COVID paused long enough for us to bring folks from around the country to shake hands and to sit in fellowship around humanities education. For any of you who are interested in joining the Teacher Advisory Council for next year, we are currently accepting applications and we'll be doing so through April 29th. Once we make selections, we'll be announcing them sometime in mid-May, and you can start making plans to also join us in Durham next fall, as well as participate in a variety of ways, not only to contribute to the work we do, but to use our platform to advance your own interests and your own career pathways. Finally, I want to remind you that all of your participation is critical to tonight's session. That starts with the audience chat box, which is where you can chatter and talk to each other, share links and resources, make comments, and generally respond on what we're discussing. However, if you have some formal questions you'd like to submit to Elsa VA, please do so through the Ask the Professor tab. Those questions will come to me as the moderator, and I'll find the appropriate time to bring them to Elsa's attention, and we'll answer the kinds of questions that come to mind. So once again, I want to thank you for joining the Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Teaching Language as Archive, Kreol and Colonialism in Mauritius. I'm joined by Elsa VA. She's the Case 16 Education Program Outreach Manager at the African Studies Center in Boston University. Hey, Elsa, can you hear me up in the northeast of the country?
Hello from Boston. Yes, I can hear you, Andy. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really here to be in this community of engaged scholarship and teaching and learning to present this topic that's near and dear to my heart, teaching the language as archive and focused specifically on Kreol. Happy spring break to those of you who are on spring break. We follow a slightly different calendar here in Boston. We are going on spring break next week, but enjoy the break, everybody. I'd like for you, if you can take some time in the chat box to share whether you speak the Kreol, a Kreol, so a Kreol from any different location, and or have experience with Kreol or teach about it, or in your French, maybe in your French or history classes perhaps. It's helpful for me to know what your background knowledge on this subject is, and as your responses trickle in, I'll continue to speak. So today I'm going to use the lens of language as a repository for history. So what do we find when we look at language, and also what do we find when we scrutinize what the scientific tools tell us about it? So this presentation, as Andy mentioned, is articulated around a curriculum unit that you can use in your own classrooms and that are part of the resources for today's session. Feel free at any time to ask questions, as Andy mentions, and comment, and as they come up, and we'll find the right time to pause and chat about them. I wanted to start off with one word, causer. I encourage you to say it. Causer means speak in Mauritian Creole. Say it, causer. And it can also function as a greeting, meaning hello, causer, causer, with all a different kind of intonation that makes it become a greeting. So this is an opening reminder to all of us that language is the most basic tool of being human in the world. And I'm intentionally starting with the word causer as a symbol for the theme of the presentation, which is really to center and to foreground the legitimacy of Creole language and voices in relation to colonial languages. The question of promoting Creole, as I mentioned before, is very central to me personally because I myself grew up in Mauritius speaking French, English, and Creole. You can see here a beach landscape, which is what many tourists see Mauritius as, a beautiful tropical island of beaches and pristine waters, with also sometimes is perceived as being an ancient volcano with endless greenery, which is what you see here on the second photo. You should know that Mauritius was uninhabited before human discovery. You may notice in this photo, for those of you who are able to see the PowerPoint, that there are some fields in the picture. These would be sugarcane fields. And if you walk through the villages and the cities that you see in this photo, you would hear Creole spoken everywhere. Behind the beauty that many enjoy, there is social, political, and linguistic struggle. So what you see here is a political poster from an organization that I am affiliated with, l'ALIT, and its affiliated organization called l'Éducation pour travailleurs, workers' education. The poster says, langage les peuples besoin rendant parlement, which means the language of the people needs to enter parliament. So today I will be speaking as an educationist, drawing from my research in Mauritius, but also through the lens of my engagement with these organizations and more broadly in the service of Kreol. So to ground us, the essential question that I'm posing, and that is also framed in the curriculum unit, is what can the Creole language, and especially the science about Creole, teach us about colonialism, colonial ideologies, and also ways to resist them? And what do we need to know, and of course, what do we need to do to decolonize Creole? I draw here from several key works. Pictured here are Emmanuel Richon's Langage Créole, Langage Marron, which is an amazing book on etymology that's translated in Creole and in French for those of you who speak French, as I see some of you do. A second book that I recommend and that I also draw on today is The Ecology of Language Evolution by Dr. Saliko Mufwene, who has done tremendous work on studying language contact in Africa and various African contexts, and also the important study by linguists Philip Baker and Guillaume Fonsing on the origins of Mauritian Creole. In the resources that I provided for tonight, there's also a short video by Derek Bickerton, who is a really important linguist to study when studying about Creoles, and he actually made this video for one of our campaigns, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But it's worth listening to. It's a 30-minute video that is featured as part of the resources. So the objectives that I have today are to examine the impacts of colonialism on the development of Creole languages in Mauritius, to analyze the role of science, linguistics, and etymology in producing perceptions of Creoles, and to discuss the role of Creole in the struggle for dignity and toward decolonization. I appreciated everybody's responses in acknowledging that language can be a tool for oppression, and equally, I want to emphasize that language can be a tool for decolonization and dignity and humanizing in the world. So when I teach about this, I introduce students to a number of key vocabulary words, concepts that really ground it. I find it really crucial to ground these concepts that students will encounter. And this is a messy slide of thrown out concepts, but for you to consider here. It will also give you some ideas of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to learn about the different types of colonies and how those have shaped the linguistic development of Creoles. We'll briefly talk about some colonial language planning and the concept of language ideology and also the language dominance. And ultimately, we'll also talk about decolonizing Creole and what that means in the context of Mauritius, and I'll share some really wonderful advances that I have been observing and sometimes privileged to be part of. So let's focus now on the context. So pictured here is modern Port Louis. It's our capital, the capital of Mauritius. If you can imagine, thriving, honking cars, a metro, thriving, bustling streets, commerce, bazaars, business, technology, vendors. Everybody is speaking Creole on the streets. I'm going to reiterate this quite a lot throughout this talk tonight. Creole is spoken everywhere. For those of you who might not know where Port Louis is and need a larger visual to situate where we're talking about here, Port Louis, you can see on this slide right now that includes the east coast of Africa, is the capital of Mauritius, located about 500 miles east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. I'm going to zoom into a different map now that's going to show you a closer visual, a more detailed map, where you can see the island in the middle of Mauritius with Port Louis and quite a few other cities. And physiographically, Mauritius is part of a collection of 3 islands called the Mascarene Islands. And these form the easternmost islands that are included in the African continent. Reunion to the east is formerly known as Bourbon, and this is where you get your bourbon vanilla name from. That's exactly the island of Réunion, which is a département d'outre-mer of France. In other words, it is still a French colony. And Mauritius and Rodrigue form part of one sovereign territory known as the Republic of Mauritius. The Republic of Mauritius is not only Mauritius and Rodrigue, but as you can see in the next slide right now, there are other islands that form part of the Republic's sovereign territory, and there have been many actual recent calls to rename Mauritius Modrigosa to account for all these other islands. And I'm going to spend some time just briefly describing what they are and who they are, because this is a part of the world that typically doesn't get talked about at all in this part of the world, and there is a lot to learn. So as part of mainland Mauritius and Rodrigue, we also have Agalega, which is the island that you see northwest of Mauritius, and Saint-Brandon, which is also known as Carcados Shoals. And they are intricately part of Mauritian sovereign territory with a 200-kilometer radius of territorial sovereign waters. So all this water that you see is also part of what Mauritius considers home. We also claim sovereignty over Tromelin, but that is disputed with France. And finally, and this is very important for a U.S. audience to know, the Chagos Islands, the Chagos Archipelago, which you can see in the northeast of Mauritius, is part of our republic. And Mauritius and we have been struggling for 45 years in regaining control of these islands, which the British illegally dismembered from Mauritian territory during the time of independence. And the people who were living there were brutally expelled. So the largest of the Chagos Island you might have heard of is Diego Garcia. And this particular island, which is why what you can see on the map right now, was leased by the British to the United States. This is the United States connection for the formation of a military base, a massive military base comparable to Guantanamo Bay, which the U.S. still uses to control this region of the world. If you have any questions about that, I'd be glad to talk about it. But this is to situate the geography.
You know, Elsa, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We do have a couple of questions that have come in I'd like to bring forward at this point. And if I'm honest, I think what you might be doing too is really either intentionally or unintentionally playing into the spring break fever of our audience. So this question comes from Mindy. Mindy is just outside of Denver, Colorado. And she's wondering, you know, it sounds like you've spent time in Mauritius. Tell us how you physically get there. What is it like to travel there? Meaning, where do you fly through? How long does it take? What's it like to go through that?
Good question. There's always ways to get to Mauritius. From the East Coast, where I am currently located, it is about you have to either fly to Europe or to Dubai or somewhere in that area, and that is about 8-hour flight, and then it is another 12-hour flight. So from Europe, from one of the destinations in Europe, or from Dubai. So it's not easy to get to. It takes quite a long time, but it's certainly an incredibly enriching place to visit. So I encourage you to go.
Fantastic.
And I see some people have some friends in Réunion, so it's nice to know about some that you know about this part of the world. Réunion in particular is totally effaced from the narrative because, of course, it is a département of France, so it's an entire French colony, and so it gets subsumed under French affairs when really it is an African island.
And one more question. This one comes from Jennifer. Jennifer's in South Florida, and this is a little bit of a personal question, but I think it's worth bringing up. Elsa, you've used the possessive quite often so far. You've talked about our and we and us. Tell us about your relationship with Mauritius.
Right. So I'm glad I mentioned this earlier, but briefly, I grew up in Mauritius of a Mauritian father and an American mother. And so I grew up speaking English, French, and Kreol. And it's in that capacity as a Mauritian citizen that I'm involved in the organizations that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that are struggling for the recognition of Kreol. And so that's my positionality as a Mauritian. And I have to also add that my positionality is also very much situated as a white Mauritian, although that is not a term that any white person in Mauritius would use. But I do situate it in the larger context of being white in Mauritius and what that means as far as my role to work toward decolonizing Creole, and that will make more sense later when I explain a little bit more about the history that led up to this.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks for bringing those questions and helping me clarify that. So now that I've looked at the geography, I wanted to turn to the history that we'll look at the Mauritian history through place names. I like to, because the place names can tell a good story, can tell a story. So take a minute to see what you have on the screen right now. We have Dina Arobi, Wak-Wak, Tirne, Mauritius, Ile-de-France, Mauritius. So based on place names, what can you infer? And that's a question I ask to students often. What can you infer about the history of Mauritius? And so I imagine, and I'll let you time to answer if you would like, that you notice the Arabic place names. And you may notice that the Portuguese or maybe some Latin language or Dutch or French. So when I'm telling you the history about the history of Mauritius, I would like you to start thinking about how this history would be formative to local language Creole development. So Arab Swahili sailors, and I apologize, it's very small text. I didn't realize it would be so small.
It'll be bigger for them, so they'll be seeing the full screen. Yeah.
Good, that's great. Arab Swahili sailors discovered and landed on the islands. Again, for those of you who might not have been here, there were no inhabitants on the islands prior to being discovered by Swahili sailors. The name Wak-Wak was used to refer to the Indian Ocean island generally in Arabic texts. And the island of Mauritius was later referred to in Arabic text as Dina Arobi, which means abandoned island. And we can imagine, for those of you who teach about the Swahili coast, that dhow ships that were used to cross the Indian Ocean in that direction would have made Mauritius feel very, very remote. The Portuguese then came after the Arab sailors who did not settle. They referred to the island and used it as a stopover, and they called Mauritius Ilha do Tirne, which means Swan Islands. That was presumably to refer to the dodo birds that were endemic to Mauritius. So the Portuguese, like the Arabs, never settled. Then the Dutch East Company arrived. The Dutch East Company enslaved African peoples, primarily Malagasi's, whom they forcefully brought with them. And along with instituting enslavement on the island, they're also responsible for decimating the endemic ebony trees and exterminating the dodo birds. They attempted to introduce sugarcane as a crop, in part because of competition with the French, but ultimately they failed in their settlement attempts because of maroonage of the enslaved to escape the horrible conditions, and the weather was also a factor in Dutch leaving. I want to also take a just brief excursion here and point out that when the Dutch left, there were marooned peoples from Madagascar, India, Indonesia, and some European sailors who had abandoned their ships and who had deserted their ships and who lived free in the Mauritian mountain highlands from about 1705 to 1710 without any colonial regime. So this short time period is now thought as potentially being the very first Creole community, and potentially also the source of our modern day Creole. So Creole community as a mixed community and the source of the language as well. But these findings are very recent, and there's been a recent call, since 2018 for more historical work on this. So watch for this because this is also significant given how early it is. And some people in Mauritius like to describe these free communities as the first Creolophone Creole Mauritians. So unfortunately, these marooned Creole communities' freedom was very short-lived, because a few years later, the French, who were already established in Bourbon, Réunion, settled the island in 1710, and they named it Île-de-France, which is where that name comes from. The French enslaved Malagasy people, East and West Africans, and people from India, and they too instated sugar and cotton and indigo exploitative plantations for 100 years. So by the 1800s, England had its eyes set on Île-de-France, and British ships occasionally raided the island and set up blockades to cripple French trade. And so almost exactly 100 years afterwards, in November 1810, they fought a battle, and France capitulated in 1810, leaving the island to the British, who renamed it Mauritius. Slavery in the British Empire was abolished in 1835. So the formerly enslaved people sought freedom away from the plantation labor camps, and I'll talk a little bit more about plantation, why it is important to call labor camps. I strongly advise you, if you teach about plantations, to empirically ground your description of these spaces of plantations in the reality of what they were, which they were labor camps. And so that is something I encourage you to do, and I do it with my students. As formerly enslaved sought freedom away from these spaces, this caused the British to shift to bring waves of indentured workers from India, and later there were waves of immigrants from China who came to Mauritius. So this is a simple visual timeline to sort of put this into perspective. If you just want to take a quick glance, as you can see, Mauritius then ultimately gained its independence from Britain in 1968, which you can see on the timeline. And it also gives you a sense of the various successor regimes that took much more time than a very, very small period of independence, which is something that echoes with some of the struggles that we are trying to overcome here in the United States in the long durée of dismantling racial capitalism and the way it has affected the United States. How could the history that I just spoke about have affected language practices? So here I'm going to turn to drawing on Dr. Mufwene's work. As I mentioned, Saliko Mufwene is a foundational scholar when it comes to thinking about how situations of colonialism have affected the development of Creoles. And he has provided the Creole studies work with some really important distinctions between 4 different types of colonialism as they pertain to language contact. And this is important because he argues that the ecology of every case of language contact is unique. So the one thing he exhorts people not to do is to not broad brushstroke, say colonization was just one thing uniformly across contexts. So the first type of colonization he talks about is trade colonization, which he describes as mercantile colonies, trade posts. Mufwene explains that these were not a threat to indigenous languages, typically, because there was often communication through interpreters, and often the new pidgins that emerged from these encounters. So, for example, Kreol in Sierra Leone and Nigerian pidgin are examples of these pidgins that have emerged from trade colonies. In contrast, he talks about settlement-based colonies, are when a colonial power is occupying a territory for the purpose of long-term social and cultural occupation. Settled colonies can often be an extension of trade colonies. They tend to favor the colonizing language, but they don't destroy the local language. For example, if you think about Algeria and the long-term settlement colonialism that happened there, didn't disrupt Arabic, even though it introduced a higher value to French in the Algerian context. But in also some other cases of settlement colonialism, it decimated the languages that Africans and Asians brought with them, as in the case of the United States, actually, and also Mauritius. So subsumed under settlement colonialism are 2 types of other colonialisms, exploitation and plantation colonialism. Exploitation colonies have for goal to extract a resource and use people for profit. And Mufwene explains how some exploitation colonies had these two-tiered economic system that was set up so that the overwhelming mass of the population continues to speak the local languages, but are managed and in authoritarian ways by an auxiliary class that is set up as being the interpreter. Wolof in Senegal might be an example of that. And plantation colonies, which is also a type of settlement colony. Again, I use the word here because Mufwene uses it, but I don't like it, and I think we need to reframe it. Is a type of settlement colonialism where European enshrine white supremacy and human exploitation. Mufwene is very clear that in these types of colonies, that you see that European languages have destroyed local African languages while promoting the supremacy of their own. And this is, to go back to the vocabulary list that I mentioned, one of the terms is glottophagy, which means really the eating up of other languages, the disappearing of languages. And this is something that Native American communities are often decrying now still, and the reclaiming of some of the languages that are dying. So in Mauritius, the trade colonialism was a feature of the Portuguese and somewhat the Dutch in Mauritius, but settlement and plantation colonialism was a feature of the French and British colonialism. So there were overlapping colonialisms in Mauritius. And there was an additional, I'm not sure if this is going to work actually.
What you should do, Elsa, is use your up and down arrow buttons on your keyboard.
Got it. Great. So I had these animations to refer to as I spoke. So as I said, Mauritius exhibits elements of all the four types of colonialisms that Mufwene talks about: trade colonialism, settlement colonialism, exploitation, and plantation colonialism as an evolution. And there's also an additional distinction between French and British colonialisms. So the French ruled directly, which means that their rule had a cultural reach as part of a broader politics of mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission. And the British, on the other hand, practiced a kind of indirect rule, and they ruled administratively, but not culturally. So the island's plantocracy, the ruling French elite, thought their financial interests would be best served by cooperating with the British. So one of the reasons that this transition happened in this way is that the island's laws, customs, religion, and private property, free trade, and even the French language were maintained. And so in thinking back to this timeline that we just looked at, this is why, even though the British ruled for much longer than the French has remained one of the dominant languages of the Republic of Mauritius. So Kreol is said to have been formed in the capital of Port Louis and solidified as a language by the year 1750. So very, very, very early on, when Mauritius was transitioning from a trade colony to a settlement and plantation colony. Baker and Fonsing, the two scholars I talked about, locate Port Louis as the capital and say that Kreol couldn't have emerged in the rural areas, in part because of the port and trade activity and the arrival of new goods in the capital. So what you see here is a bazaar in the 1890s, but the period of solidification of Kreol is actually about 100 years earlier. And of course, Kreol, spoken in Mauritius, is part of many Creolophone world and so many other countries which speak their own form of Kreol. So what you see here is a map of the Atlas of Pidgins and Kreol Language Structures online. APIX is the acronym. It's a really great resource. I think it's included in some of the resources in the lesson. But if we take this map as a cultural artifact in and of itself, and it actually sheds light a little bit on how the science around Kreol has framed Kreol. So this is an exercise I also do with my students. I ask them to look at the legend, the different colored dots that you see here to the left, upper left side. So what does the map legend tell you about the way Creoles are defined? How is Mauritian Creole defined?
Elsa, if you would like to actually ask that question of the audience, we can put it directly to them, sure. And so, audience, I'll remind you that this is not hypothetical. We would love to hear your responses. Elsa, why don't you frame that question one more time so we're really clear about what we're asking, and we'll invite you to type that into the audience chat box.
Sure. So if you look at the legend, how does it frame Creole?
Great, thank you. And now we'll pause just for a moment and let folks catch up with us.
Yeah, Jessamine says French-based, exactly. Yeah.
Andrew, you might see offered a parallel of progressive stages of a disease in the body. Thank you, Amy.
Yep. Based on a colonizer language. Yep. Yep.
While folks are responding to this, Elsa, I'd like to bring a question to you. And please, audience, continue to respond to Elsa's direct question. This question comes in, and I'm wondering if you can talk to us about how this material is taught in Mauritius. When you were a young person, how was this presented to you as a student?
It's a very simple answer. This was not presented to me as a student. There is an entire void of thinking, talking about this in the school spheres in Mauritius. At least when I was growing up, things are changing a little bit currently, because there are some activist scholars who are really pushing for this to be included. And I'll talk a little bit about this because I'll share some cases from the educational system in Mauritius. But this is not typical in Mauritius. And in fact, I was looking at the list of attendees, hoping that some Mauritians would be in the crowd, but I didn't see any Mauritian names. But this is not a very typical conversation and not a typical presentation that you would hear in Mauritius in a broader public sphere. So this is considered still very countercultural to think about Creole in this sense, and you'll have a better sense why. Yeah. So Andrew says there's an English-French influence, right? So as you all notice, even in a good resource like the APICS map, all of the Creoles are defined as English-based, Dutch-based, Portuguese-based, French-based, and so on. So in many ways, Creole is defined as being the child of those languages. There's a mother and child or parent and child reference here, as if there was a unique parent to which Creole owed life, and as if the colonial languages made the Creoles as a derivative of themselves, right? So what is important to point out, and to point out to students if you teach about this, is that the framing based on a parent language is ideological. That is a set of constructed ideas about a language. And the science of linguistics also contributes to this set of constructed ideas. So I'm going to share two ideas here about the science. The first idea is oops, how do I do this? There. Why does it keep on going back? Oh, there we go. Thank you for your patience with my technological challenges.
You have it? Okay, great.
So the first is an idea that we saw with Mufwene already, that pigeon to Creole evolution. So in a situation of contact that requires communication, all of the parties involved simplify their languages and initially produce a pidgin. The science says that the scholars who adhere to this theory says that pidgin typically emerge in trade and settlement colonies, and they're typically simplified, and they serve as lingua francas, so lingua francas that are used for daily communication and for transactions. And the first generation of these speakers speaks a pidgin. The theory goes that the next generation, the children of these speakers, learn the grammatical rules involved in the pidgin, and they learn themselves native speakers. And so then Kreol, which is then a stable language because children are learning it as their mother tongue, is launched. It's a beauty. It's a wonderful beauty to think about it in that way. And that is the idea of Kreol being a stable language. And that idea, from one linguistic perspective, is incredibly important to us who are trying to claim legitimacy, that this is a language that stands on its own. It's the mother tongue of so many children and adults. across Mauritius, but also across the world. The second linguistic theory that is used and talked about very frequently when talking about Creole is this idea of substrate, superstrate. However, this is one of those linguistic theories that does the exact opposite of being liberated. It actually reinforces the colonial ideologies, and I'll explain why. In this theory, linguists propose that most Creole languages have a French or another lexicon, so a vocabulary, which they refer as a superstrate. Okay, that is, it's lexified by French, and an African or an other language substrate, which then would consist of some of the grammar and syntax, the more quote-unquote invisible non-vocabulary elements. And so that is why, so this is, some linguists still adopt this theory. It's a substrate, superstrate, so it's French lexicon and African and other base, it's syntactical base. That's why the map has the legend French-based, English-based, Dutch-based, and so on. And that is an assumption that is grounded in some tendencies in science, which leads to an ideology here that Creoles are lexified by these dominant languages, that the dominant languages actually contribute the entire vocabulary of a Creole. So the question is then, is that theory right in the case of Creole? Is this substrate, superstrate theory right? And so I want us to turn quite extensively to look a little bit about the formative inputs. So who created Creole? Who was involved in as speakers of the first Creole, that first Creole that was solidified as a language by 1749 is the first text that was found, but by the 1750s. The primary source here that I'm showing is the reports, some of the colonial reports on arrivals by 1735. And you can see from this primary source that there are people of many geographical and cultural backgrounds made up Île-de-France. You can see that 33% of people were from Madagascar, and that you can also see that there were steady arrivals of Tamils and Bengalis throughout those years. You can see that in the first table, West Africans featured prominently in the first wave. So here you see Yolof, 31%, Bambaras, and Juda, or we can interpret it to be Ouida, or present-day Benin. And a few years later, the same data shows the many people who came from Madagascar and Mozambique really being the majority of people. Senegal was also 12.40%, and Bengalis and Tamil. This is under l'Île-de-France. And so on top of this immense linguistic diversity, we also have to imagine the different arrivals brought very specific vocabularies from different people. So different dialects and nautical dialects that came with sailors, and various tradespeople that brought very specific knowledge bases with very specific registers attached to those knowledge bases. So on the basis of this data alone, we can infer, and again, this is a question I'm happy to ask you. Can we say that Creole is French derived?
That's a pretty direct. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Can we still say that Creole is French derived?
Give folks a moment to consider the data, compare the charts.
Yeah. So I'll offer some thoughts here. On the basis of exactly who was speaking Creole, who were the first peoples of Mauritius to speak Creole, it is impossible to imagine that all of the French vocabulary would have been adopted and lexifying Creole, right? There's just such immense diversity already. And we know very well that there was some French present in Creole. We know that there was some linguistic imperialism And we can't assume that there was much mutual intelligibility among the enslaved communities, but we also know that there was purposeful solidarity breaking and mixing of people of different linguistic backgrounds to quell the revolts. We also know that France was trying to centralize a colonial language policy, where France, for hundreds of years in the colonies, but also in the French territories themselves, were trying to promote a French-only linguistic policy, which is something that we see up until today in some of the lois tout bons that came up in the 90s in French by some French francophone French-only ideologies. But if we take Creole as an archive, so looking at the language itself, and imagining all the different people of cultural backgrounds that have made up this initial solidified language, stable language, we can see the beauty in all the formative inputs. And this takes a very, very different story. It tells a very different story than what linguists say about the substrate, superstrate theory. So look at this list of words here. Look at this list of words. Creole as an archive. In which ways Creole is an African language? What do these Creole words suggest about the ideology surrounding this substrate? So I'm going to pause for a moment for you to look at some of the words that I've chosen to foreground here. And you can see that our vocabulary, our lexicon itself, is highly informed by Malagasy and other influences. We have so many words. Fangourin, which is a sugarcane press in Malagasy. Tombave, which is a skin disease in Malagasy. We have Watiwala, which means here and there from Wolof. Ourit from Madagascar again. We use the word bazaar from India. We also have a number of Tamil words. And this is just one example amidst words that are also from Indonesia, also from different Indian origins. So Tamil is just one of the many examples of Indic languages. From Tamil, we have kotomili, coriander, which we use in all of our foods. Murum, which is moringa, wonderful for digestion, and a very ubiquitous word that every Mauritian word uses, which is ayo. It's an exclamative that all Mauritians use to mean anything they want. It can mean sadness, it can mean happiness, joy, and all sorts of meanings. So ayo is one of those terms that comes from Tamil. So moving beyond vocabulary and the lexicon, we can also see that we have some syntactical choices that we make as Mauritian Creole speakers that are directly derived from African languages. So spoken Malagasy determines deeply how we speak and the meanings we make. So reduplication of adjectives is something we do, and I sometimes actually do it in English myself. But we repeat the adjective twice, like is done in spoken Malagasy. And that changes the meaning of the word. So when we say triste to mean sad, we say triste, triste, and that means a bit sad. Causer, which is the word I chose as a symbol for this presentation, means to talk. And cause causer means a little chat, a little chat. You can chat. And I find I have to refrain from doubling up my words to attenuate the meanings here, because it's just such a beautiful way of expression in doubling up the words and changing the meanings to attenuate them. We also double it up to make things something bigger. So, un grand la case, a big house, and grand la case means a very, very big house. Other influences that we have is etymologically agglutinated articles. So some linguists, again, the linguists that think about Creoles as French-based and French-derived, used to say that our words, let's say, for example, the word l'âge, which is the word l'âge, which means age in French, So that L apostrophe came from French as the article. But Philip Baker, who is somebody I draw extensively from, shows that this is a feature of Bantu noun classes, where the first syllable of every word is a class prefix. We also have Bhojpuri informed genitives. So the word so, which we use also quite a bit, Elsa so sœur, Elsa's sister, Mike so madame, Mike's wife, is a feature of Bhojpuri, which is also spoken in Mauritius. It's the second language spoken at home in Mauritius. So there's so many examples of how African languages and Asian languages both inform the vocabulary of Mauritius Creole and the syntactical features of grammar, of grammar and word order, and various types of syntactical features that create meaning.
So I've got a question I'd like to bring to you. This comes from Hugoette, who I'm going to reframe it a little bit and ask if any of what you're sharing has also class distinctions. How do, through this language, how is class attached or associated?
That's a really, really important question, and it plays into what is happening in Mauritius today. But Creole has been perceived as devalued, even in the context of Mauritius. So Creole has been seen as a language of the street, as a language and not a language of any educated, any upper class elite person. So in a larger context of a neoliberal meritocratic society, this perceiving Creole in that way really plays into the force of the two dominant languages in Mauritius, which are French and English. French is spoken in business, on day-to-day business, and English, I'll share a little bit of very concrete cases later, but is the statutory language of the state. And so it essentially cascades Creole down to a lesser value. And I'll show the exact statistics of who speaks Creole in Mauritius, but everywhere Creole is spoken. It is our national language. Thanks for that great question.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So to conclude this part, the lens that most linguists offer us is that Creole is French lexified, and that's very troubling. But we can see here that Creole is not only French-based or French-derived, and we need to unpack that. And I encourage you, even Creoles are seen as patois, as vernaculars, similar to many other vernaculars, and we need to stop that association with the dominant language. And that is an ideological stance. It's a constructed idea because it enforces the connection to the colonial language, and it minimizes the Africanness and the Asianness in the language input. It also minimizes the diversity and the massive complexity of the Creole language, which was born out of a denial. And so I chose one quote from Googie that I find very inspirational. As some of you know, Googie is a very, very fervent defender of the speaking African languages and writing in African languages. And so as a symbol for also Creole, so African languages refuse to die. They would not simply go the way of Latin to become the fossils for linguistic archaeology to dig up, classify, and argue about. And so this is Mauritian Creole refused to die. The Africanness in Mauritian Creole refused to die. The Asianness in Mauritian Creole refused to die. It's there. It's just a matter of what lens with which we see it. And this matters a lot to, it's very consequential to questions of class, of education, for Mauritian children, and so on and so forth. So this brings me to the last part of my presentation, which is why is this important? I do want to talk about right now that we're going to fast forward to the present to make a connection to present contemporary issues, because it's those same ideologies that started under colonialism, under racist colonialism, that have traveled all the way up to now. So this will answer your question about class, which was a really good one. Look at the statistics of who speaks Creole as a mother tongue. This is from the 2011 census in Mauritius. 84% of Mauritians speak Creole as a mother tongue at home with their mothers. And I'm choosing this language very intentionally because the language that we speak with our mothers is the language of our hearts and of our spirits. 5.3% speak Bhojpuri, 3.6% speak French, and then there's a number of heritage languages that are spoken at home. What language is absent here? So there is an absence of English, right? So, and this speaks again to the way the direct rule, indirect rule. Nobody speaks English at home. Not one person in Mauritius speaks English at home, but it is taught in schools, so most people can speak English, but really the dominant language is more French and Creole. And yet, even if nobody speaks English at home, English is the statutory language of the Constitution and of our assembly proceedings. So the picture that you see here is our National Assembly. Creole, the language of Mauritius, is not allowed in Parliament. It is not allowed in the sense that if you go, you have a grievance and you want to testify in front of members of the Assembly, you will be translated in the minutes that are taken in Parliament. So there's already an act of interpretation going on about the words that you are using to describing your situation. Members of Parliament speak English to each other and on occasion French. And you can see here a picture, and this is to the right is the law about how language will be used in Parliament in Mauritius. The proceedings and debates of the Assembly shall be in the English language, but a member may address the Assembly in French. Moving on to the school setup, school settings. So curriculum is of the core disciplines in Mauritius. Science, so we're talking about science, social studies, and math, is in English. The curriculum is in English. Young children enter school and are learning about the beauty of their world through a foreign language that is English. And this is the area where I do research, has been in schools in Mauritius. And the way teachers use language in the classroom is that because the curriculum is in English and it is de facto a second or third language for Mauritian children, and all of the content needs to be learned through this, and it's tested in English, teachers do this linguistic dance. They start in English, they ask students to repeat, then they revert to French, then they speak in English again, and then they speak in Creole, right? So Creole ends up being the default, the last resort that gets used when the child doesn't understand. And this is for all the learning except for the one subject of Creole, and Creole is taught as a subject. Children are tested for the Cambridge Certificate examination in England. So the testing is done directly in England. And you can see here in the former slide that some of the pictures that I put up here is from a very recent curriculum reform that dates back to 2018, 2019. And so even as recently as 2018, it's very small, and I apologize, but one of the principles that is shown here is multilingualism. So they included some language around multilingualism in Mauritius, but there was no role specified in the curriculum for anchoring children's learning in their mother tongue, except for one small paragraph where they talk here about the role of the mother tongue in preschool, right? So with students and in the lesson that I've included as a resource, I do an exercise of, there's a number of experiential activities that you can do to teach this. What does it mean to learn through a different language? So you ask students to speak tell you about their weekend, and then you ask them to tell them about your weekend and remove the letter E. So all of a sudden they have a frame that is impeding their ability to make meaning, and that is a very powerful activity that simulates the difficulty that Mauritian students have in the classroom. In the classroom as well, I've collected a lot of data on student work. And so this is students' work from a 5th grade classroom. This is considered student work as upper tier of her class. This particular student was doing really great work. You can see it's all in English. And there's one clue, and I'll point it out to you because I know it's very hard to read since this was a scanned page. But there's one clue that shows you that even though this is considered excellent student work in the top 10% of her class, she writes, why and herbs and spices used. So this gives you a clue, and the teacher corrected it and put, why are herbs and spices used? It gives you a clue that the student is actually copying those words from the board, because there's that mistake between the verb are and the conjunction and, right? So this is not productive writing as we want students to do, creative, producing work themselves. This is copying because of the barrier of English. I also documented many students who could not read or write in 4th and 5th grade. So this is a statistic that leads to 25% of students failing the Cambridge standardized test at the moment in Mauritius. This is from the latest 2020 data. In this particular examples of student work, you see how students who struggle with not being taught in their mother tongue are made to copy lines one by one, and you can see in the picture of the right that they're made to copy lines, Port Louis Range, Black River Range, so looking at the different mountains in Mauritius. But the students, if you can zoom in a little bit, you'll see that the students are actually writing their letters vertically, right? They're not able to even write the letters horizontally, in part because of the demands of the English curriculum and the absolute absence of Kreol being used as a mode of meaning making for students to speak the beauty of their meaning making in the world. So we do have a situation where most students are failing colonial, so many students, a much higher percentage than should be, are failing the Cambridge tests. And yet, at the same time, there is, this is very recent in the last 5 years, there's a tokenistic use of Kreol in the private retail sector that sells products to tourists and to the bourgeois segment of the population. So here you can see some posters that are written in Kreol and a baby onesie. So it's tokenistic uses of Kreol that don't challenge the larger structural problems of not having Kreol in parliament and not having Kreol in schools. You also have tokenistic uses of Kreol being taught to tourists as the national language. So here you have a Kreol lesson at one of the resorts in Mauritius being taught. And we also, as recently as 2018, have very clear news writing in Mauritius that is continuing to reproduce the exact same ideologies that we saw that are hundreds of years old. That Kreol is nothing but a patois, the daughter of a French, and that written Kreol, that written is only oral and that it should never be written. So we do need to see ourselves and the ideology and ask our students what has changed since colonial times. I do draw on Lilia Bartolome's work, who, if some of you know her, she's Donaldo Macedo's wife in the ESL world, a good friend of Paulo Freire, to talk about ideologies. And I ask students, you know, how are these ideologies used to justify this social order? And how might that compare to what is happening here in the United States as well, with the struggle across languages that is happening here? And And this is also a good opportunity to introduce students to this idea of neocolonialism, so the continuation of colonial ideologies and practices after independence through through new means, right? To use Nkrumah's term. One activity that I really enjoy doing with students in terms of probing those ideologies is a Jamboard activity where I have texts that look at that have different ideological stances, and then I ask them to categorize the different text expert as liberatory or as neocolonial, and that really helpful to really unpack some of the ideologies that are embedded in the way we talk, right, about the language. I do want to end on some more enlivening work that is being done, because I've painted a picture of very difficult structural neocolonial situation in Mauritius, but thankfully there's so much amazing work being done at the moment. And this is not only in Mauritius, but the Seychelles are struggling for the same. Haiti is struggling for the same. Réunion is struggling for the same. There's really tremendous global work that is being done in favor of Creole rights. And so I'm just going to highlight a few examples that are, I think, really quite meaningful. So after decades of debates, really decades of debates, Mauritius advanced a standardized system of writing Creole. And the really fascinating thing about this is that, and the picture you see is the Rapport Graphie-Laharmonie, which is the report that spelled out the way we are going to write Creole from now on. It dates back to 2004. It delinks Creole from French spellings. So very intentionally, all of the linguists and scholars and parliamentarians in Mauritius who decided on this chose to not associate Creole with French, the orthography, I mean. In addition to this, a full grammar book was done. So the grammar, the orthography, all of it has been codified with just an immense amount of work of previous generations of scholars. And the Académie Créole Mauricien was founded. So this is just tremendous institutionalization work that has happened in Mauritius. The organization I mentioned in the beginning, this is a slide that you've seen before, but they have been actively demanding for Creole to be allowed in Parliament. So this poster now should make much more sense to you why we're demanding that Creole be allowed and be used as a medium of instructions in schools and the core disciplines. The same organization, l'Éducation pour Travailleurs, was held a hearing, an international hearing, with many different scholars, including, for those of you who are familiar with this literature, but Robert Phillipson, Tov Skutnab-Kangas, Derek Bickerton. So that video I mentioned earlier was part of the testimony that we did in 2009 to demand for Creole, but also to provide evidence to the government and how harmful it was to continuously suppress the mother tongue in these spaces. I submitted testimony as part of that report, and we submitted it to the Ministry of Education. So another big, huge victory has been to introduce Creole as a subject in schools. So you can see from the textbook covers here that Creole is now a subject. So it's taught as a grammar, but also the literature is taught. And we do have a literature corpus of novels, of theaters, of plays, of books that have. We've also organized translation festivals. So people who just get together and take good texts in English and French and organize them to translate into Creole and some of the great works of the world. There's a couple other activities here that I enjoy doing with Creole, with students. One of the really core activities that it can be really helpful is to talk about the policy with students and have students compare the policy in Creole in Mauritius with the policy in Creole in Seychellois, which is the Seychelles Creole. Seychelles is light years ahead of Mauritius as far as Creole in schools, and just the language is so much more humanizing about Creole and the way they write their curriculum. So it's an interesting case study to compare and contrast both of them. And then another activity that I do with students is a persuasive writing, and it can help us in the struggle. So if you ever do this with your students, send it my way. But why should Creole Mauricien be used in Parliament in Mauritius, and doing some research about that and forming and building up an argument for why Creole is necessary in those spaces. So to end here, I want to reiterate, and I'm happy we'll have some time for more discussion, because I know your questions have been trickling in, and I want to address them. What does Creole teach us? What does the Creole language teach us? Creole can teach us that the grammars, the syntaxes, and words of all the people who participated in its formation and struggle for recognition over centuries and still today. We just need to let Creole, causer, speak, and we need to listen to it. We need to listen to the voices of Creole as a symbolic ode. And so, Andy, if you wouldn't mind sharing the little clip that I shared with you. This is an audio clip from some amazing Creolophone contexts that are from Haiti and Mauritius, to demand recognition, but also celebrate how much meaning and identity lie in the language.
Great, thank you. And I'll play an audio clip now for the audience, and then we'll take some questions.
Créolophonie, c'est du monde par-ci, du monde par-là. Le Haïti comme à la Louisiane, nos quatre coins de l'océan, nous pécos créole par tous côtés. Créolophonie, c'est un trait d'union qui aide nous pour mettre sa bonne culture là en avant. Pour qui nous apprendre qu'on les autres créolophones dans les mondes entiers. Nous envie qu'on banne les autres langages mama, style, manger, boire, la musique. Depuis ce raga jusqu'à ce maloya, ce sega jusqu'à ce compas, ce jazz jusqu'à ce reggae.
And I'll put a link to that SoundCloud clip in the audience chat.
That's great, because there are also some really amazing other sound bites from different parts of Creolophone context. So that's wonderful.
Great. Elsa, thank you so much. We've got some questions I'd like to bring to you now with the time we have remaining. And I, again, will remind and encourage the audience to submit those questions formally in the Ask the Professor tab. They'll come to me, and then I'll bring them forward one at a time. Let me start with a question, actually, that's been sitting with us for a little while. This comes from Jessamine. Jessamine's located in Napa, California. And she's wondering if you could talk a little bit about the history of Diego Garcia.
Yeah. Backing up to our geography, I'm glad you're interested, because as I said earlier, Diego Garcia, all U.S. people living in the U.S. should know about it, because the U.S. has a very, very, very big military base there. The U.S. there's also documentation and some news that there was under the Bush era some extraordinary rendition happening in Diego Garcia. And there are some reports that there are some nuclear warheads that are being held there. But Diego Garcia is the main island of the Chagos archipelago, as I mentioned, northeast of Mauritius. And so under UN clauses for decolonization, it is not allowed to dismember a territory when a territory gains independence. So Diego Garcia, as the main island of the Chagos archipelago, was part of Mauritian territory, just as Rodrigue was, and Agalega, and Tromler, and so on. And there was a deal done by our first prime minister that essentially secretly leased or gave up the Chagos Islands, the whole entire archipelago, in return for independence. And this was not legal. And so what happened in the following, so we're talking about 1968, Mauritius gained its independence. There were still about 2,000 3,000 people living on the various islands, Diego Garcia being the most populated, but the other islands were also populated. And the British used very awful tactics to expulse people. It was brutal. They literally put people on ships, and people ended up in England, the Seychelles, and Mauritius. And any animals that were remaining were gassed, and there was a whole plan for the military base to be secretly leased to the United States on a 50-year lease. So the lease was up in 2016, and it was renewed for another 50 years, even though we struggled quite extensively against that. There have been some advances. So the International Criminal Court just declared Britain guilty. This was a 2019 and 2020 ruling. I can't remember quite the year. So there have been some really important legal advances, but given the strategic location, the geopolitical strategic location of Diego Garcia, this is, and Mauritius being Little Mauritius and the United States and Britain being empires, this is a struggle that will continue. So because regardless of the ICJ's ruling, there's not much that we are hoping right now that can happen. Ironically, and this speaks to some of the struggles that many African communities have with conservation parks, but ironically, the British wanted to establish a conservation park on Diego Garcia because the islands are really beautiful. They contain tremendous fauna and flora, and beautiful lagoons and very pristine coral reefs and so on. And so they wanted to establish a marine park, which would then keep people out even more. So if the marine park had been established by the British, and Mauritians fought back against that. Long-winded answer, but it is an important part of the world that I'm so glad you asked about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Next question comes from Tisha. Tisha's in New Haven, Connecticut. And here's a comment with a question. Tisha asks, recently there's been pushback from members of the Black community in the United States about the adoption of the African American Vernacular English, AAVE, by those outside of the Black community to seem cool and gain social capital in places like TikTok. Is Kreol ever deployed in such a way, or because it's the language of Mauritius, does that not come into play?
Can you repeat the last part of the answers?
Certainly.
That refers to TikTok?
So in U.S., there's a strong pushback in the Black community about the co-opting of African American vernacular English in social media to try to seem cool. Does Kreol face the same kind of pushback, or is because it's the official language, or is it deployed in these same kinds of culturally appropriated ways?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there are many parallels between African American vernacular English and Kreol in terms of perception, some of the struggles, some of the language policies and practices, and yes, absolutely. Some of the examples that I shared with Kreol being used on posters and on baby clothing and so on are a way to really capture that exact same process that you are describing of African American vernacular English being co-opted on TikTok and being pushed back against that, because Kreol is being used for profit by various companies but tokenistic, right? It's not a structural change. It's not a structural change to advance the importance of elevating the language, the perception of the language, and actually introducing it as a legitimate language in spaces where that is meaningful and important. So, for example, schools. In terms of social media, there's a lot of social media Kreol stuff out there, let's put it that way. The balance of power is different because Mauritius is a predominantly it's a nation of people of color, so people in Mauritius would never say that word. That's why I'm hesitating. But it's today 60% Indian, both Hindu and Muslim, 30% Afro-Creole descendant, and the last 10% is shared between Chinese Mauritian and European Mauritians. And so the racialized politics behind the use of Creole on social media are very different, because it's not as if it's a white person appropriate African American language here in the US. It is Creole mother tongue speakers who are using it for the most part on social media. So that makes a very big difference. Everybody speaks Creole. It's our national language. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. This question comes from Sundina. Sundina is in Los Angeles Unified School District. And she asks, is there a growing movement to restructure government policies for requiring the usage of English and French to using Creole in Parliament and other places? Do you think there'll be a change in the near future?
I don't think there'll be a change in the near future, but I think there will be a change in the future. So yes, there is a growing movement. Some of the slides that I showed at the end are very much examples of that. And I just must again nod in honoring so many people that have pushed for Creole, both in terms of standardizing the language and coming to an agreement on the orthography, and pushing it as a language. There still is entrenched status quo thinking in Mauritius by members of parliament. So there is this sense that Creole is the language we speak at home, but everywhere else it is important to access English. That is the language of economic advancement, and therefore we need to continue to promote these, no matter how detrimental it is to people's identities and spirits. So we've come a long way, and there's a long way to go.
Yeah, certainly. This next question comes from Raquel. Raquel wonders if Creole is taught as a language, grammar, and literature in a similar way as we study English in schools in the U.S.
Yes. So Creole is taught in schools as a heritage language, and this is very problematic and complicated because two things. It was introduced alongside other heritage languages. So in the schools, the curriculum is in English, and teachers do the linguistic dance that I mentioned. But there's also Arabic being taught, Hindi, Marathi, Urdu, Tamil, Hakka, Mandarin, and as heritage languages. And the 30% Afro-Creole population that I mentioned to you earlier felt like there was no representation of an Afro-Creole language, even though Creole is a national language. So there was a big ethnicized pushback to introduce Creole as a subject in schools. And so the Creole is now treated as a heritage language, which is a very big paradox because it actually isn't a heritage language, but it was treated as a language introduced in order to cater to the Afro-Creole population of Mauritius, because that group did not have linguistic representation in the landscape of heritage languages taught in school.
Got it. Thank you. This next question comes, actually I'm going to swing back to Tisha for this next question because I think it plays a little bit off of the question you just responded to. Again, Tisha's in Connecticut, and she wonders if you can describe when and how Creole became stable, meaning with an agreed upon grammar and spelling. Was the first Creole text in the 18th century? Is the first dictionary, for example, prior to 1968 in independence or after?
Yeah. So languages are always evolving, right? So stability is an elusive term. Certainly stability in terms of a recognizable Creole, so for example, if I listen to the stable form of Creole, the earliest form of the stability came in 1750. Around 1750, there was a text that was the first Creole text that was found, that was a legal document in 1749, written in 1749. So all linguists agree that by then there was a stable form of the language, which means that any native speaker of the language can recognize it as such. And the stability has certainly evolved, and the Creole dictionary and all of that has happened all after independence. So all of these advances in orthography, grammar, the Academy of Creole, all of those happened in recent decades. But certainly the language itself has evolved because all languages are dynamic and in flux based on the speakers and the registers and what we use language for.
Elsa, we have two more questions before we need to unfortunately conclude tonight, and I'm going to bring these from a slightly different direction to draw that conclusion. First question comes from Seth. Seth is in Knoxville, Tennessee, East Tennessee, and Seth wonders if you can tell us where there's large populations of Mauritians, of people from Mauritius in the United States. What schools, what classrooms might tend to have students with this background?
Interesting question, Seth. Thank you so much. There are many diasporic Mauritians throughout the world. We typically there hasn't been any, thankfully. So the process of decolonization in Mauritius was peaceful. There has not been any war. We don't have a very active army, and so the Mauritians have tended to emigrate for economic issues. A lot of them to Australia, some to India, some to South Africa, and those who have made it to the United States and or Europe tend to be those who can afford to do that. So you'll find Mauritians actually a lot in the universities here, but this also means that these are Mauritians that have the financial capital to be able to study abroad. I know of several Mauritian students at Harvard. I know that every university in the United States actually probably likely to have some Mauritians if they attract some international student population. But beyond that, there's not a lot of pockets of Mauritians in the United States, at least. In Australia, there are. In Canada, there are, in part because of more relaxed immigration policies. But I don't think you will ever encounter a group of Mauritian students in your classrooms as young students.
Great, thank you. Last question, Elsa. This question comes from Gretchen. Gretchen's in Rochester, New York, and you've mentioned several times tonight the students you work with or the students you teach. So I'm going to bring this question from Gretchen, but I'm also going to advance to this slide so you can tell us more about the students you teach and the resources you have at the African Studies Center.
Sure. Yes, this is a slide as we leave off. So as Andy mentioned, I lead the BU African Studies Center Outreach K-16 Education Program. We are a national resource center alongside other national resource centers. And Andy mentioned earlier that Howard University Center for African Studies is also a center, and we have, I think, Brenda with us and potentially also Vanessa with us in the room. So all the national resource centers have the primary mission to serve teachers in promoting the Africa-related content in the classroom. So any Africa-related topic, any resource that you are seeking, we are happy to help, and it is our role and mission to help. So we have it locally in Boston. We have a Teaching Africa library. We also invite teachers to apply to our Teaching Africa certificate program, which is a mix of courses that are very affordable. We also recommend many of the National Humanities Center courses as part of that certificate program. And all the workshops are free. And then we have a whole array of online curriculum on our website, which is bu.edu/Africa. And we also have our famous How Big is Africa poster, which I'm sure some of you have or you've seen before. And we offer professional development events. So please check out our professional development events on our webpage. And I reiterate that we do this alongside 9 other national resource centers that have the exact same mission as us and are there to provide for you. We do have a collective website for our work, which is outreachasa.org. And that is where you can find all of these 10 universities, national resource centers that are here to serve you in promoting Africa-related content. And we all offer events. So join our mailing list, and I hope to see you at a future event.
Elsa VA, thank you so much for leading the conversation tonight, for sharing your perspectives and this just very provocative history and culture, and allowing us to think with you about the ways that language is used in this format. Elsa, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for all your great questions. Thank you, Andy.
I want to thank the audience as well for joining us tonight. Please do follow the National Humanities Center for upcoming opportunities and activities. That includes our next webinar just 2 nights from now. I'll be joined by past fellow Tate Keller from Rhodes College. He'll be working with us on his research around the environmental impact of World War I. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We hope to see you Thursday night or at another Humanities in Class webinar. Have a great day at school tomorrow.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.